Thank you, Mr Speaker. Speaker, as Leader of the Opposition, it gives me no joy, none at all, to move this motion of no confidence in Premier Daniel Andrews and the ministers of his Labor government. In usual circumstances, I believe that an elected government should have the opportunity to serve out its full 4-year term before facing the judgment of the people of this great state at an election. But today, in Victoria, in October 2020, circumstances are far from usual. Today, millions of our fellow citizens are confined to their homes under the direct orders of government and backed by the threat of fines and arrest, only being permitted to leave home for one of 4 specified reasons. Today, tens of thousands of Victorian enterprises, most of them small businesses, have been ordered by this government to close their doors, unsure when or even if they will be able to trade again. Today, hundreds of thousands of Victorians are unemployed, while hundreds of thousands more have seen their income slashed by a Labor government literally preventing them from going to work. Today, we mourn 792 Victorians who have lost their lives due to this government's gross incompetence in allowing a virus to escape back into our community. 792 lives that should be with us still. Today, we face a Premier of this state who has subverted the democratic principles of this state, restricting the parliament, sidelining the cabinet, ignoring the fundamental rights of Victorians and concentrating power in his own hands. So, because of these extraordinary circumstances, because of the urgent need for change, and because of the immeasurable damage that the Andrews Labor government is doing to the state that I love, I move this motion of no confidence today. How did it come to this, Mr Speaker? How did Labor take Melbourne from being the world's most livable city to the world's most locked-down city? How did our state, the education state, if you believe the slogan on the number plates, how did the education state keep so many of our children out of the classroom for so much of this year, hurting their ability to learn? I look around and I see so many of the things that define us as Victorians have been lost. Our major events, either cancelled, like the Formula One Grand Prix, or poached by other states, like the AFL Grand Final. Not to be played at the mighty MCG, but at the Gabba among the footballing heathens of Queensland. We are the live music capital, yet the music has stopped. The venues have closed and many wonder whether they will survive. We have the best dining in the nation, but our restaurants, our cafes and our pubs are closed or so restricted that many don't bother to open. A state of creativity that can't visit a gallery, go to the ballet or the cinema. A state that embraces so many faiths, but the only thing they have in common is harsh government restrictions on how they can worship. A multicultural state that has banned community gatherings. A sporting state that has, to all intents and purposes, banned the playing of sport. An industrious, hard-working, entrepreneurial state whose people are denied the opportunity to just go to work. This is the legacy of the Andrews Labor government's mishandling of the response to COVID-19, and the damage that it has done strikes at the very heart of what it means to be a Victorian. Speaker, in December 2019, what we now know as COVID-19 is believed to have originated in China, in the city of Wuhan, a new form of coronavirus that proved highly infectious and with fatal consequences in some instances. Extreme measures were taken there, including sealing off the city and strict housing detention to limit the spread. The virus is believed to have taken over 3,800 lives in Wuhan, with over 50,000 people infected. Other countries noted with concern what was occurring in China. The warning bells were sounded. On the 25th of January this year, the then Minister for Health in the Andrews Labor government, Jenny Mikakos, sent out a tweet. The tweet said, We have confirmed a case of the 2019 novel coronavirus in Victoria, the first in Australia. There is no need for the community to be alarmed. Our health system is well prepared. to manage infectious diseases. Goodness me, Speaker. Well, if Twitter was only reality, things would be very, very different. If Twitter was reality, Hillary Clinton would be in the White House and Bill Shorten would be in the Lodge. If Twitter was reality, Victoria would have been properly prepared for the global pandemic that has made its way to our shores, as the Health Minister had boasted back in January. But that was not the case. We were not prepared at all, Mr Speaker. As The Age reported, and I quote, Victorian Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton's team was so poorly funded that top bureaucrats warned the Andrews government multiple times the state's public health unit was the worst resourced in the country. I make that point again, Speaker, the worst resourced in the country. The warning to government even claimed, and I quote, a doubling of current staff members would still see Victoria as the least resourced state in terms of staff undertaking public health officer duties. So, Speaker, Victoria started off behind the 8 ball. We were not prepared, we were not well resourced, we were not able to cope when the wave hit. We had a grossly underfunded public health team and an arrogant government that assumed everything would just be okay because the Health Minister tweeted that it would be. Speaker, arrogance and incompetence are a very toxic combination, but that has been the hallmark of this Andrews Labor government, arrogance and incompetence. In Victoria, we saw infection numbers move slowly from that very first notification. It took from the 25th of January to the 4th of March for Victoria to move from 1 to 10 infections cumulatively. From the 25th of January to the 4th of March. Speaker, that is the time we had to prepare. Even if we weren't prepared before the first case hit, we were given a window of opportunity between the 25th of January and the 4th of March. What actually happened then? Where were the plans put in place to make sure that we had the testing kits available? Where were the plans put in place to make sure we had the personal protective equipment we needed available for our frontline healthcare workers, for others who needed them? The fact is, nothing was done, or whatever was done was far too little and far too late. By the 11th of March, Victoria had recorded a cumulative total of 21 cases. In just 1 week's time, that figure had jumped from 21 to 121 cases, and COVID-19 was off and running in Victoria. It even caused the cancellation of the 2020 Australian Formula One Grand Prix. On the 16th of March, the Premier declared a state of emergency in Victoria. By the 27th of March, Victoria's cumulative infections had risen to 574, including 3 deaths. So there was no doubting the seriousness of this pandemic, or that most of the infections had been sourced from overseas travellers returning to Australia. And this is a key point, Mr Speaker. We didn't start off with any cases in Australia domestically sourced. They were all imported at the start, and that was our opportunity to stop this virus from spreading. In fact, so serious was it that the National Cabinet met that day. Now, the National Cabinet was, I think, an innovation that Australians welcomed. You had the Premier of the 6 states, you had the Chief Ministers of the 2 territories and the Prime Minister meeting in a group to try and make sure that decisions could be taken in the national interest to protect us from the damages and the risks of coronavirus. And on the 27th of March, the National Cabinet determined that to minimise the risk of further importing this virus, a system of hotel quarantine will be established for all returning travellers. And the wording of the decision, Speaker, is important. It states, designated facilities will be determined by the relevant state or territory government, and these requirements will be enforced by state and territory governments with the support of the Australian Defence Force. Now, Speaker, our Premier, Premier Andrews, he sat around that virtual table as a member of the National Cabinet. In fact, he had boasted that hotel quarantine was his idea. He said, this was my suggestion, I've put it forward. You would have thought that on that basis he would have been listening to the decision. He would have been part of it, because the decision said they will be enforced with the support of the Australian Defence Force. But even give him the benefit of the doubt, the Premier is a busy man. Maybe he didn't read the text of the decision of National Cabinet. So let's listen to what the Prime Minister said at his press conference that day. He said, by no later than midnight tomorrow, that is 11:59 p.m. Saturday, states and territories will be quarantining all arrivals through our airports, in hotels and other accommodation facilities for the 2 weeks of their mandatory self-isolation before they are able to return to their home. We will be supporting them also by providing members of the Australian Defence Force to assist in the compliance with these arrangements. The ADF will be there to support those enforcement authorities. Speaker, it couldn't be clearer. The decision of National Cabinet said the ADF would be there to support states and territories with enforcement. The Prime Minister's press conference of the day made the same point. But, Speaker, maybe the Premier somehow inexplicably missed this offer, you might say. Well, that might stand up, except for the fact that the Premier himself put out a press release on the same day, on the 27th of March, and under the heading Enforced Quarantine for Return Travellers to Combat Coronavirus, it says, and I quote, "It has also been agreed that the Australian Defence Force will be engaged to support the implementation of these arrangements." Surprise, surprise. Well, Speaker, why does this matter? Why does this matter? And I make this point for future readers of Hansard, for those who have not lived through the hell that has been Victoria over the last few months. It matters. It matters because the hotel quarantine inquiry heard as uncontradicted evidence that the government's failure to manage hotel quarantine is directly responsible for Victoria's second wave of COVID-19. Over 99% of all COVID infections in this state are directly sourced to outbreaks from quarantine hotels. Outbreaks caused by the Labor government's decision to turn their backs on the Australian Defence Force, to turn the backs on the offer that you were given, to turn your backs on trained, professional people who understand about infection control, who are disciplined, who weren't moonlighting doing other jobs, who weren't nightclub bouncers brought in because you wanted to give them a job rather than get somebody who knows how to do the job. That's why it matters. And I'll tell you why else it matters, Speaker. It matters because this Premier has tried to say that black is white. He's tried to say that night is day. He gave evidence before this Parliament's Public Accounts and Estimates Committee in April this year, and when he was asked about ADF support, he said, quote, "It is fundamentally incorrect to assert that there was hundreds of ADF staff on offer and somehow someone said no." What, so the decision of National Cabinet wasn't enough for you? The Prime Minister's press conference wasn't enough for you? Your own press release, Premier, wasn't enough for you? Why are you taking us for fools, Premier? Why do you expect us to believe what the facts prove otherwise? Now, the Premier has been dishonest in seeking to deny those objective words, the objective words of the decision of National Cabinet, of the Prime Minister's press conference and his own press release. Now, Speaker, it's not even as though there was something that was offered once and then it slipped out of the collective mind of the Labor government. In fact, there have been a number of different offers of ADF support to Victoria to assist with hotel quarantine. On the 8th of April, the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Philip Gaetjens, emailed the then Secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, Chris Eccles. And he said, because Chris Eccles had asked the Commonwealth for financial assistance with the hotel quarantine program. Mr Gaetjens replied the only financial help the Commonwealth could offer was, quote, in-kind provision of ADF personnel, as it had done in New South Wales. Mr Gaetjens said, "I am sure the Commonwealth would be willing to assist Victoria if you wanted to reconsider your operating model," to which Mr Eccles replied, "Thanks, Phil." Now, isn't it interesting, Speaker, that at the hotel quarantine inquiry, Mr Eccles couldn't remember whether he'd passed this offer on to the Premier or the Premier's office. Just another evidence of amnesia that we got from so many witnesses, so many politicians, so many senior public servants at the hotel quarantine inquiry, Speaker. But even that wasn't the only time ADF was offered. We know that on the 24th of June, Emergency Management Commissioner Andrew Crisp formally requested 850 ADF troops to help with hotel quarantine and have that granted, only to rescind the request the very next day. The very next day, Speaker. you've got to ask, what were these people on? How could they get it so wrong? Why would they say no to the Australian Defence Force to look after hotel quarantine? Hotel quarantine was not there as some sort of employment program. It wasn't running a holiday camp for returned travellers. It was a frontline public health defence. It was what we needed to do to stop the virus coming into our community and causing death and causing devastation, which is exactly what has happened. And Victorians want answers, Speaker. They demand answers. They're entitled to answers, Speaker, because Victorians have been the ones to pay the price for this government's failure. So it wasn't just the decision to turn their backs on using the ADF in hotel quarantine, Mr Speaker. It was also the decision to use untrained, unprofessional private security guards. No, they could have used Victoria Police, they could have used correction staff, they could have used a host of other people who would have been better off at dealing with return travellers and infection control than a bunch of unemployed nightclub bouncers and part-timing Uber drivers, because that is where some of those people were recruited from. To think you're going to have your frontline health defence recruited via Gumtree tells you that this government was more interested in creating jobs than it was in actually getting a job done right. And that was reinforced by the fact that a Parks Victoria employee who was seconded to work over in hotel quarantine was advised he had to undertake mandatory training in diversity but nothing in infection control. Speaker, is it any wonder this has turned out to be a complete and utter fiasco? A complete and utter fiasco. Now, Speaker, we find out recently through the hotel quarantine inquiry that, in fact, apart from a lack of tenders for the private security guards who are engaged, we also find that Trades Hall, Victoria's peak union body, was involved in the decision over selections. Now, were Trades Hall there to make sure the right people for the job got the job? Was Trades Hall at the table to ensure the taxpayers got value for money, that the most professional and most qualified people were given the contracts? Or was Trades Hall there to try and make sure that the most union-friendly firms were given the contracts? What is important to this government? Was it a public health outcome, or was it looking after your union mates? Because we know what happened. We know what happened. Unqualified, unprofessional people who weren't up to the job were given the job by your government. And the consequences of that have been absolutely devastating. Absolutely devastating. And of course, the tragedy is, Speaker, that Victoria had actually beaten off the first wave of coronavirus. We had suffered restrictions. We had suffered lockdowns. Yes, there was pain. There was pain. But we had seen it through. You could say we'd effectively seen it off. We had gotten down to very low case numbers, 0 on some days, low single digits on other days, and we were ready to open up again, and we'd started to do that. And just as every other state was opening up and getting their schools open and their businesses open and their lives back and their jobs back and their freedoms back, Victoria alone went backwards. Victoria alone sunk into the mire of a second wave, and a second wave created by the failures of hotel quarantine. This government has let this state down like no other government has done before. You can't blame anyone else, Mr Speaker. You can't blame the returned travellers. You can't blame even the guards. You can't blame anyone but a government that put people in charge who were not up to the job. And as I say, the hotel quarantine inquiry made it very, very clear this was a government that had failed to do its job properly. But the trouble is, no one is putting their hand up. Absolutely no one is putting their hand up and accepting responsibility for what this government has failed to do. And I think, Speaker, a lot of Victorians are distraught and upset and depressed. And they look at this government, they look at politics in this state, and they understand that in a pandemic things happen and things happen quickly. What they do not understand is this government's failure to take accountability for what they've done. Where is the person in this government putting their hand up and saying, yes, we made the mistake, I made the mistake, it's my fault, I'll go? It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And that brings me to the hotel quarantine inquiry. Initially a $3 million, now a $6 million. It'll probably wind up being much more than that by the time we get to the end of it. An inquiry to find out the truth, to answer that question that the Premier says seems unable to answer. Who decided to use private security guards for hotel quarantine that led to this disastrous outcome? Normally you find the truth by asking a question and giving an honest answer. But clearly this government thought that wasn't something that they were capable of doing. Victorians have been shown contempt by so many witnesses at this inquiry. Have Victorians seen the truth, Speaker? No. They've had an avalanche of amnesia. They've had a cavalcade of cover-ups. They've had a litany of lies. They've had everything but the truth. And that's what Victorians deserve. We've had ministers who get up there, people who are paid very handsome salaries courtesy of the taxpayer, people who are given very large and important responsibilities by the parliament and by the governor to do their jobs. But all of a sudden, when it comes to the big questions, the biggest issue this year, their memories go hazy. Their memories go blank. They just can't remember who said what to whom. And it's not just the Labor ministers, it's some of the people that this government has appointed to the most senior positions in this state. Whether it was the former Department of Premier and Cabinet Secretary Chris Eccles, somebody who is one of the highest paid bureaucrats in the country, and gave evidence that, no, he didn't call Graham Ashton, the former Chief Commissioner of Police, in response to his text. No, I didn't call Graham Ashton, I didn't call Graham Ashton. And he clung to that lie. He clung to that lie until the very day that the hotel quarantine inquiry said, produce the phone records, sunshine. And then guess what happened? Oh, all of a sudden, that phone conversation that he could not remember, oh yes, well, it must have happened. But even though Chris Eccles can't remember the conversation, he knows this thing about the conversation that he can't remember, he did not convey a decision about hotel quarantine and the use of private security guards. And it takes a particularly twisted form of logic, a particularly flexible form of the truth, can I say, Mr Speaker, for somebody to say, I do not remember a phone conversation with the former Chief Commissioner of Police, but I remember what I did not say. Unbelievable. It is literally unbelievable, but the sad thing is clearly Mr Eccles believed that we would believe it. And he would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for those pesky phone records. You just have to wonder how many other ministers, how many other people who've given evidence to that inquiry should be back in that box, back answering questions once they've actually had their records produced. Because there's one thing we can be very confident of as a state, it is that we simply cannot take on trust anything that these ministers say and anything that their senior public servants say when it comes to the hotel quarantine scandal. They are all running for cover, Mr Speaker. They are all ducking and diving and weaving, desperately trying to avoid responsibility for what is the greatest failure of public administration in this state's history. Speaker, so we look forward to the hotel quarantine inquiry continuing its work, but I say the inquiry must recall all those key witnesses. It must obtain the phone and electronic messaging records of all those key witnesses, otherwise it will lack credibility. Victorians deserve the truth. Too many people have died, too many people have suffered. There's been too much damage done for this to be swept under the carpet. It is more important to find the truth than it is to stick to an arbitrary timeline for a report. The Premier's previously said anything the inquiry's asked for, he's given it. Well, the inquiry should ask for more time, as much time as it needs to find out the truth. Because the truth, if it doesn't set you free, it will at least grant some peace to Victorians who have been so badly affected and so hurt by this government's failures. Speaker, I'd like to turn to other aspects of why this no confidence motion is so important. Because it isn't just the failure over hotel quarantine. It isn't just the failure to manage the pandemic properly. In many cases, Speaker, it has been the response. Because this response has been dreadful. Those who should have been supported have not been. This government has played favourites, picking who it wants to back and letting other people go under a bus. It has been absolutely disgraceful, in particular the way that small business has been treated by this government. If you are in a large unionised workforce, if you're in manufacturing, for example, or construction, doing work on the government's projects, this government has bent over backwards to make sure that the CFMEU members can get back to work. But if you're a sole trader, in many cases you can't even work. And not only are you denied the opportunity to work, you're denied any financial support whatsoever from this state government. Absolutely appalling. Why is it that until very recently somebody working as a gardener for a council is entitled to go to work and cut grass, but if you're a franchisee for Jim's Mowing, you can't go to work and cut grass? Does the government seriously believe that there is any difference in health risk from somebody depending on whether they work for a council or whether they're a sole trader, a franchisee? Absolutely not. It's just that this is a government that is simply interested in looking after its mates and is clearly playing favourites, and it is actually hurting a lot of people who are just not in a position to fight back. Because they don't care, as the member for South West Coast points out. They don't care. Not too many paid-up union members amongst the small business community, so this government's decided to send them under a bus and say, we just don't care about you. We don't care about you at all. We've seen complete lack of support for sole traders. Sole traders make up around about 300,000 plus jobs in this state. Sole traders are the smallest of small businesses, and they have been so badly damaged by this government's restrictions. So badly damaged. People who have the ability to go to work and to do so without any contact with anybody have been denied that opportunity. So whether it's your Jim's Mowing franchisee, whether it's somebody like a window cleaner, whether it's somebody who might be a personal trainer, until very, very recently, these people have been denied the opportunity to simply go to work. And yet the government has said, not only are we denying you the opportunity to work, we're also going to exclude you from any financial support whatsoever. How mean, how cruel, how vindictive to say to hundreds of thousands of sole traders, we're going to deny you work and deny you financial support at the same time. This is an ideological attack, is what it is. It's an ideological attack by a Labor government who's always hated small business, always hated people who want to go and work for themselves. That's what it comes down to, and that's what we've seen from this government. And even when they actually came up with their pathetic, paltry, belated $3,000 grant, they had to admit that more than 90% of sole traders would not be eligible for it. What a slap in the face. What a slap in the face. But this comes from a government who, by and large, have never worked in business, don't know the first thing about it, only regard it as being an ideological enemy. That's the way they regard it, Speaker. That's the way they regard it. Speaker, so we've seen the attacks on small business. We have seen the failures to deal properly and to tell the truth over the hotel quarantine debacle. But it gets worse, Speaker. It gets worse. Think about some of the measures that have been put in place that just simply don't add up. Think about the captain's calls we've seen from the Premier. Think about the curfew, for example. What about the curfew? We have gone through wars. We have gone through civil unrest. Not a lot, thankfully, but in our history, we have gone through challenging times as a state. And yet, in all that time, we have never, ever had a curfew to lock people in their homes from 8 p.m. until 5 a.m. Yet that's what this government put in place. What was the public health basis for that curfew? None. We had a Premier who admitted that the Chief Health Officer never asked for a curfew. We had a Chief Commissioner of Police who admitted he'd never asked for a curfew. This was the ultimate captain's call. What sort of man makes a captain's call to lock up 5 million Victorians in their homes without a basis for it? This Premier. Speaker. This Premier is the sort of man to do that, and that is why Victorians can have no confidence in him. Now, I've been proud to stand with Michelle Loiello, who is a small businesswoman, a mother of three, who has taken the step of challenging that curfew in the Supreme Court of Victoria. It may be the case that the opposition may not have the numbers in this chamber, but this government must still be held accountable. This government must still be held accountable before the law, and this government must be treated equally under the law like any other citizen. And I congratulate Michelle for her courage in taking on this government. And I congratulate her pro bono legal team for doing the right thing, not something to advance their careers, but something because they saw something that was wrong and they wanted to right it in the best traditions of the bar, the best traditions of legal practice, speaking truth to power. And isn't it a coincidence, or maybe not, Mr Speaker, that at 5 a.m. on the Monday morning that the case was being heard in the Supreme Court of Victoria, the curfew suddenly disappeared.
Funny, yeah.
Suddenly disappeared. This was something that the Premier announced was so important and was essential to stopping the spread of the virus. And the minute that he gets challenged, what happened? Off it went. The curfew disappeared, never to be spoken of again. Well, I'm so pleased that the court has continued to hear that case, and I look forward to the judgment of His Honour. Clearly I don't know what it's going to be, but I do hope that if this government has acted illegally, if this government has acted unlawfully in locking up 5 million Victorians in their homes with no basis for it, there must be consequences. Because what gives you the right, Premier, what gives this government the right to lock up Victorians in their homes, particularly when there's no basis for it? And now we see others have been increasingly empowered and emboldened to challenge and stand up to what this government's doing. And we see that High Court proceedings have been initiated this week to challenge some of these restrictions that make no sense. And that's the thing, Speaker. All the mantra about we're all in this together, this government doesn't believe it. This government doesn't believe we're all in this together because it has restrictions that suits it and then others that don't. It changes things around depending on its political interests, not on health interests. It puts people under curfews, not without any rational public health basis, but because the Premier thought it was a good thing to do. You've got the single-person bubble, which says that one person can have a bubble with another one person. And as Professor Catherine Bennett, the Chair of Epidemiology at Deakin University, has made the point, what's the point of that? If one person has got coronavirus and you're meeting with someone else and you give it to them or they give it to you and you go home to your household, guess what? You're all going to get it. It makes no logical sense. And this is what we see time and time again, a government imposing restrictions with no proper health basis, no valid scientific basis, just a simple desire to control Victorians. Because ultimately that's what happened, Speaker. When this second wave hit, when we got up to the hundreds of new cases a day, we had a government which had to admit it couldn't control the virus, so it decided to control Victorians instead. And that is no substitute. That is not the job of this government. It's not the responsibility of this government to try and lock up the people of this state, to restrict the people of this state, to make up for its own failings. If we had a government that did a proper job when it came to testing, the second wave would not have been as prolonged as it has been. Because remember this, Speaker, hotel quarantine created the second wave, but the only reason we are still in it, months and months later, is because this government has stuffed the basics. You've stuffed the testing, you've stuffed the PPE, you've stuffed the contact tracing.
It's still stuffed.
And that is why we are still in this hole. And we're not going to get out of this hole while we have an arrogant government that won't admit it's wrong, while we have an arrogant government that won't fix its mistakes, while we have an arrogant government that will not change. And that is why, Speaker, if we cannot change this government's mind, we must change this government. And that is what this no-confidence motion is about, Mr Speaker. Now, Speaker, let's look at some of the testing issues. We know that early on there were not enough testing kits. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the government had been given warning of the coronavirus in Australia, in Victoria. It had effectively a month between the first case and an increase in cases after that. What happened? Where were the testing kits? Who knows? Who knows? Early on we had confusion over who could be tested. Could asymptomatic people who were close contacts of a confirmed case be tested? There was confusion back then. Speaker, 7 months later, there's still confusion. There is still confusion. Even today, we had the Premier and the Minister for Health boasting about the wonderful response at Kilmore and the Oddfellows Cafe and how people were lining up to get tested. But that's because the government allowed asymptomatic testing. It meant if you didn't have symptoms, you could still be tested. But what happened when it was the Chadstone cluster? Could asymptomatic customers of the Chadstone cluster get tested? No, they couldn't. No, they couldn't. So, Speaker, even to this day, we have mass confusion. Now, I don't know whether it's penny pinching or it's hard to explain. We've had medical practitioners crying out there saying, for goodness sake, just test, test, test. That is the best way to try and reduce the spread in the community. The more you can test, the more you identify cases, you then isolate them and it stops the spread. It's not rocket science. Even someone like me can understand it, Speaker, but this government seems incapable of understanding it and acting on it. Why on earth would this government treat the people of Box Hill, the people of Chadstone, so differently from other people? Why would you have different regimes for testing? It makes no sense whatsoever. Let's have a look at contact tracing. Contact tracing is how you put a fence around the virus. Contact tracing is why New South Wales has been able to stay open despite the fact it's had as many cases a day in some instances as Victoria has. Because contact tracing is about making sure that once a case is identified, it can't spread further, or you limit how it spreads. And New South Wales has done it well. What was Victoria's technology when it came to contact tracing? Fax machines. Fax machines. Hello, 1980s, your public health policy has called. For goodness sake, a fax machine. Well, I'm not surprised the Leader of the Nationals may not know what a fax machine was. Might be too modern technology for you, Walshy. But I think I still have one in my office, but I don't think anyone's used it for a long, long time. But this government was relying on fax machines for contact tracing. Doctors who had identified cases could not email it in. They had to fax it in. You had people with pens and paper, doing the recording. For goodness sake.
Why not an app?
For goodness sake. Other states have got it right. Other states, not every state was perfect at the start, but they learnt their lessons and they improved and they got it right, and Victoria has failed to do that. But all the time we heard from the Premier, oh no, things are fine, there's no issues here, we're doing really well, we're doing extremely well, don't worry about that, Victoria's fantastic. There was actually it would be amusing had it not actually been so concerning, but we actually saw the Premier claim not all that long ago that in fact New South Wales was following Victoria. That in fact they felt that we were actually ahead of where New South Wales was. Now the funny thing was New South Wales came out very, very quickly after that and made the point that no, we are not following anything Victoria's doing. And why would they? Why would they? But this is a Premier who will say and do anything, absolutely say anything and will do anything simply to try and skate through a press conference regardless of whether it's the truth or not. So, Speaker, if you can't fix up contact tracing, you're never, ever going to be able to get the state open as much as it can be. Now, of course, we had very early instances where the government was aware of issues and failed to act. And does anybody remember Cedar Meats? Yeah. Cedar Meats, about 5 months ago. Now, this government had actually been very keen to come out and publicly name and shame and identify certain people who'd been infected with the virus. So, for example, a doctor in Toorak who had caught the virus didn't have the symptoms that would require him to get tested under the government's own guidelines, but out of an abundance of caution, because he was a very careful person, he got tested anyway and confirmed that he was positive. And then we saw the Minister for Health coming out attacking him as being unprofessional. Well, I've never seen a reaction from the Australian Medical Association and from Victoria's doctors the way I did to that appalling attack by former Minister Mikakos on that particular doctor. People knew he had done the wrong thing, and the minister was completely out of line in attacking him. So the government was very keen to come out and name and shame and identify people who'd caught the virus in some circumstances. But when it came to Cedar Meats, which was a company who might have donated $15,000 to the Labor Party, all of a sudden the shutters went down. And the government was extremely concerned not to have any identifying details come out. And people knew that there were issues, but the government wouldn't confirm it, it wouldn't confirm the identity of the place. And then a media outlet, I think it was Channel 7, broke the story and confirmed there was an outbreak at Cedar Meats, something the government had tried to keep to itself. Typical of this government. Let's try and publicly shame a hard-working local doctor, a hard-working local general practitioner, because he happens to be in Toorak, but let's try and keep secret the name of one of our donors where there's been a massive outbreak of coronavirus. And of course the failure to publicly name Cedar Meats early on has arguably led to an expansion of the cluster. Because how many couriers and transport workers and meat inspectors and contractors and others have gone through that premises while it was still infectious because the government never released the name of it? So you see a government prepared, as I say, not just to play favourites, but to compromise public health outcomes based on political partisanship. And that is another reason why Victorians can have absolutely no confidence in this government. Still on contact tracing, I raised in Parliament in question time a few weeks ago a situation of a woman who sadly contracted coronavirus in July and passed away. And in August, after this lady had died, DHHS contacted the family to start the contact tracing process. It's a little bit late when the patient's died, Mr Speaker. And this is in August this year. So despite all the Premier's claims that contact tracing is fine, it's all been fixed, we're better than the rest, New South Wales is coming to us for advice, it's just not the case. And it never has been. It never has been. As the Shadow Treasurer mentioned in question time, the ABC recently referred to the fact that until the 1st of June, the number of cases, mystery cases, in New South Wales out of the total of local cases was 33%. Between the 1st of June and the 10th of October, that proportion came down to just 4%. A massive reduction. Now, why is that important, Speaker? Because mystery cases are the ones that you worry about, where you've got identified clusters and you know the people are close contacts. Even if the numbers are out there, you can at least isolate those people because you know they're close contacts. The mystery cases are the ones that the epidemiologists, the public health experts worry about more. New South Wales were able to decrease their proportion of mystery cases from 33% down to 4%. In Victoria, our numbers for that period up to 1 June were 22%. And you know what our numbers were between 1 June and 10th of October? 22%. We had not got any better, Speaker. We had got no better at all. How many more months do you need? How many more cases do you need? How many more deaths do you need before you just fix up contact tracing? They're just not capable of it, Speaker. They're not capable of it. As I said earlier, arrogance and incompetence is a very toxic cocktail, and this government has it in spades. The arrogance to believe that they're doing it perfectly, or to quote the former health minister when it came to Cedar Meats, absolutely perfectly. The arrogance of that and the incompetence to not know what you're doing. And that's why this government is a danger to the health of Victorians, because you're not getting it right. You can't admit you got it wrong. So how on earth can we trust you? How on earth can we have confidence in you to fix it? Let's look at the issues about personal protective equipment. We've seen that PPE is absolutely critical to making sure that those who are working with COVID patients are protected. We owe it to our frontline healthcare workers to look after them. They put themselves in harm's way. They do a job that many of us couldn't dream of doing, with a lot of challenges. The least we owe them is the ability to actually look after themselves and protect their health while they do that important work. Yet in Victoria, we've seen too many occasions there's just been insufficient personal protective equipment. It just hasn't been available. Even appallingly, a report in the Herald Sun, I believe it was the Herald Sun, that at the Alfred Hospital, certain health teams had the choice of either effectively stealing, I might say borrowing without authorisation, PPE from other sections of the hospital, or paying for it themselves. Speaker, none of our public healthcare workers, none of our frontline healthcare workers should have to face that choice of putting their hands in their own pockets to actually protect themselves at work, or having to borrow without authorisation from other sections of the hospital. That is just outrageous. That is just outrageous. We had the former Minister for Health, Jenny Mikakos, claim in Public Accounts and Estimates Committee that healthcare worker infection numbers were in fact quite low. Then the actual data came out, and it turned out she'd been giving misleading evidence again. It was up around 70%, not the sort of 10 to 15% that she'd been claiming. Speaker, it is just bizarre. How can one government get so many things so badly wrong? So badly wrong. Well, the Member for South West Coast says they've been too busy spending too much time trying to cover up, and I think she is right. And we've seen under this government the tendencies, not just of this Labor government, particularly its Premier and its senior ministers, a centralisation of power, a willingness to sideline everything and everyone that doesn't agree with them or that might have a contrary view. This parliament has been sidelined for most of this year. Compared to other years, we have barely been able to sit. Now, this could have been done. We could have been sitting in a COVID-safe way, but the Premier doesn't like accountability. The Premier doesn't like scrutiny. The Premier doesn't want to answer questions. That's not Dan's way. No one challenges him. It's dangerous, is what it is, Speaker. It is dangerous. And then, apart from ignoring the parliament, he's gone and sidelined his own cabinet. Created this COVID crisis committee, the Gang of Eight, running the state, sidelining every other minister, keeping them out of the loop. And we know that even amongst that Gang of Eight, there are the ones that are on the inside and there are the ones that are on the outside. We know how it really works, Speaker, because effectively this Premier wants to be in charge of everything. He said, when he announced this decision on the 3rd of April, he said, "That is why I've today established a Crisis Council of Cabinet, the core decision-making forum for the Victorian Government on all matters related to the coronavirus emergency." So, Speaker, if you thought this was just about a few important issues here and there where they needed a quick response, it was nothing like that at all. This was all about the Premier asserting control over his own cabinet and over this parliament, and just avoiding anything that looked like accountability, because that's the way this Premier operates. And, Speaker, we've seen that unwillingness to follow proper advice through some of the initiatives that have been introduced. When it comes to masks, and the Leader of the Nationals raised the questions today about mask wearing in regional Victoria, the Premier admitted that his advice has gone beyond, or sorry, not his advice, his actions have gone beyond the advice. Who is Daniel Andrews? Who is the Premier of this state to decide that he knows better than the public health experts who are not telling him to go as far as he's gone? For goodness sake, we are all subject to the whims of this man, to the whims of this Premier, not based on medical advice, not based on scientific advice, not based on public health advice, because of the way he feels about it, the way he wants to do it. Well, that is not good enough, Speaker. It is absolutely not good enough. And we see that in the lack of a realistic roadmap. This state must be able to open up. We need our lives back. We need our jobs back. We need our kids back in school. All of them, Deputy Premier, all of them. They all deserve to be back in school. But it's not happening. Why isn't it happening? We've now got a Premier who is trying to chase an elimination strategy. And we know why. We know why. I think it's a question of trying to expiate his guilt over having given us the second wave. I think he knows his legacy is in tatters, that he'll be remembered for one thing, and that's the damage that he has done to this state. God forbid the Premier ever gets his 3,000 days up and gets his bronze statue outside the front of One Treasury Place, but if they do, he'll have a mask on, because that's how he'll be remembered. That's how he'll be remembered. Speaker, what we're seeing is a Premier who has gone rogue, a Premier who is not following the advice that every other state has followed. Because if this Premier was serious about getting this state open again, about giving people their lives back, about letting families and friends come together again safely, other states have given us the roadmap. New South Wales averaged more than 10 cases a day, every day in July and August. Do they shut down the entire state? No. Do they shut down all their schools? Do they shut down all their small business? Do they cancel all sport? No. They stayed open and they did it safely, because that is the only alternative. Unless you're willing to close down the state and all the damage that that will do, we must learn to live with this virus until there's a cure or a vaccine.
We have to.
And Speaker, that is the only realistic option, but it's not one this Premier is willing to pursue. The former Health Minister, Jenny Mikakos, when she resigned, let the cat out of the bag, that it was actually an elimination strategy that was being pursued. Even last Sunday, Speaker, we heard the Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, talk about that we can squash this virus down to zero. Speaker, no one in this country realistically thinks that that is going to happen. And even if it was possible, the pain, the devastation that you are going through to get to that point would not be worth it. How many people are going to die through suicide? How many people are going to die through people not going to hospital for their cancer checks? How many people are going to suffer immense mental health episodes if this Premier continues to have his foot on the throat of this state for much longer? Speaker, well, member for South West Coast said, haven't we flattened the curve? That's a three-word phrase you don't hear very often these days from the mouth of this Premier, is it? Flatten the curve. Remember that? Remember that was what it was all about. The strategy was all about buying us time so that our hospitals could cope with any outbreaks. Well, at the moment, I think we have 0 cases in intensive care.
On a ventilator? No one on a ventilator?
No, not a single Victorian on a ventilator relating to COVID-19. You would have thought that's a pretty successful example of having flattened the curve. We've got well under 200 active cases in the entire state. In the entire state. Speaker, there is a better way. There is a better way. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can listen to epidemiologists like Dr. Catherine Bennett. You can listen to modellers like Professor Tony Blakely. People have actually advised the Premier in the past, and they say, we don't need this. It doesn't need to be this harsh. For the good it is doing, which is questionable, the damage it's doing is much, much worse.
What about who? What about the World Health Organisation?
Well, and you've got the World Health Organisation recently coming out and making the point that lockdowns are the worst way to deal with it. It's a last resort. What a lockdown is very effective in doing is making poor people even poorer. And you would have thought that a Labor government, self-proclaimed champions of the underdog, self-proclaimed champions of the oppressed and the downtrodden, might have actually had some care, some concern, some compassion for people in difficult financial circumstances, but this government has made a deliberate decision to make it worse. As Member for Evelyn reminds us, public housing towers, people locked up in their homes with zero notice, and then given out-of-date food and not provided with the sanitary and health products that they needed at the time. Just appalling. Now, Speaker, as I say, there is a better way. There is a better way. We have already laid out our alternative roadmap for immediate action. That is abolishing the 5-kilometre rule, which makes no sense and is just simply cruelly keeping families apart and keeping friends apart. All of our school students should be back in the classroom.
Today.
Should be back in the classroom. Speaking as a parent of a Year 8 and a Year 10, I can tell you it has been a challenge for mum and dad, but it's much harder on the kids. The kids deserve the chance to finish off what has been a shockingly hard year with a full term in the classroom. And this government has denied them that. Denied them. Retail, restaurants, offices should reopen. Yes, with masks, yes, with density limits, but they can be reopened safely as they have been in other states. We should be easing restrictions on weddings and funerals and religious services.
Absolutely.
This can be done safely. Social distancing, yes. Masks, yes, if you need them. But for goodness sake, just banning them or limiting them to 5 people outside, that's never going to fly. We've got to resume junior sport. Our kids deserve to get back out there. They need it for their physical health. They need it for their mental health. They so need it for their mental health. And non-contact community sport should be back as well. The bowlers, yes. The tennis players, yes. The cricketers, yes. Even the golfers, Let them have a go. For goodness sake, you can be cheek by jowl with people in Dan Murphy's, but if you're on a golf course separated by a fairway, apparently that's a greater risk. That makes no sense at all. We should be immediately introducing current New South Wales rule for regional Victoria. Yes. We have next to no cases in regional Victoria, and outside Mitchell Shire, I think we actually have no cases.
That's correct.
No cases at all in the entirety of regional Victoria, outside Mitchell Shire, which is simply an expansion of the Chadstone issues. And Speaker, so there is no way that Victoria should remain locked down. But I fear that this government is hostage to a Premier who is pursuing an elimination strategy that is only going to eliminate jobs, that is only going to eliminate hope, that is only going to eliminate the bright future this state deserves. And the other thing is we have no indication whatsoever of when this Premier is going to ease up.
Nope, that's right. No indication.
We were supposed to be getting the big relief on this Sunday. Then all of a sudden the Premier said, oh, actually, no, that's not going to happen now. He's still got this fantasy of we only get the restrictions eased to a larger extent when we get 14 days of 0 cases. It's not going to happen, Speaker.
It's a virus.
Are we really going to be held hostage to this Premier, to this government and their weird concepts of elimination when no other state has sought to do that and every other state has been able to do what they have to do to reopen safely?
How many businesses lost?
Well,
How many lives?
this is going to be a generational disaster. The mental health aspects of this will be playing out for years and years to come. Earlier this year we saw there was, I think it was a 33% increase in presentations at hospital amongst young people over self-harm and attempted self-harm. That is such a worry, Speaker. It really is. When you see our young people having such a terrible impact, that this lockdown is having such a terrible impact on them, at what point is the government going to say we're wrong? At what point are members of the Labor Party going to say to their Premier, mate, you've got this wrong?
When they vote at 7 o'clock tonight.
You can't keep doing this to us. Find your voice. Find your conscience.
Yeah, vote today.
Find your heart for Victoria.
People need
Vote to protect Victorians, don't protect Dan.
Exactly.
Vote to protect Victorians' jobs, don't protect the Premier's job.
Think of the worker.
Do the right thing. Do the right thing. You know, there are some very good people on the other side. And I know that...
Name them.
Interjections are unruly, thank you, Leader of the Nationals. But there are some good people on the other side, and you know that this is the wrong thing for Victoria.
It's killing people.
And you know that until this Premier goes, it's not going to stop. It's not going to get any better. And I know it's a big ask. And I know that you're probably not going to do it. But I just hope that you think about it. I hope there's a little twinge of conscience there. It's not all about the team colours. It's about Team Victoria. It's about getting this state back. It's about giving us hope. It's about giving us life. It's about giving us something to look forward to.
Other states are doing it. You're wrong.
This is the worst thing I think this state has ever experienced, I'd say without a doubt. So what we face is a pandemic that's not just taken hundreds of lives. It's closed down tens of thousands of businesses, and it's cost hundreds of thousands of jobs and kept millions of Victorians locked down in their homes. It's the biggest failure of government in this state's history, arguably in the country's history. I don't have any confidence in this Premier, Daniel Andrews, but I've got every confidence in this state. I have every confidence that with the right leadership, we can come back from this, and we will come back from this. But if we're going to change, we need to change at the top. If we're going to change the way we're dealing with this pandemic and give ourselves a chance to reopen and get our lives back and get back to work and get our kids back into school, we need to change the government. And that's what today's motion is about. It's about giving Victorians a chance that we deserve. Because too many Victorians have suffered too much for too long. And we can't keep living like this. This is not living, Speaker. It's not living at all. And Victorians deserve better. I'll conclude by quoting once again Peter Harcher from A Piece in the Age from a few weeks ago now. But I think it's very apt. He talks about ministerial responsibility, he talks about the pandemic, and he talks about what's gone wrong. And he says, everyone is sorry. No one is responsible. Ministers preside over catastrophic failure and mass death and keep their jobs and their powers and their privileges. It doesn't matter how glaring the failures of their departments, how many die as a result. The dead go to the graves, ministers back to their jobs. Well, Speaker, today is an opportunity for this parliament to speak with a voice for Victoria. Not Liberal, Labor, National, Green. A chance to speak up and say we need a fresh start. We can't keep living like this, and we don't have to. A vote of no confidence in Premier Andrews is a vote of confidence in Victoria and its future, and I commend the motion to the House.
Hear, hear.